Hello, I'm Jan Szrewiński. Welcome on board the Eastern Express, and as always, I hope you enjoy the journey. This time around, we are here to bring you the latest on the looming cat-and-mouse game in the Baltic Sea. We turn our gaze to a region once described as a NATO lake. But, spoiler alert, if it's a lake, there is a rather large and angry bear floating around in it, and nobody's entirely sure how to get it out. We're talking about Russia's clandestine maritime meddling, otherwise known as the Dark Fleet, or the Shadow Fleet. If you haven't heard this phrase before, that's likely because it sounds like a forgotten installment of the Pirates of the Caribbean. Only this time, it's not rum being smuggled, but Russian oil. Without further ado, let's take a closer look at the issue to find out more.
The Eagle S is apparently the gift that keeps on giving. Finnish authorities have revealed that the ship, which has been detained over damaging Baltic Sea cables, has a whole host of serious deficiencies.
The final count is 32, of which 3 are serious enough that each one alone would have been a reason to detain the vessel.
These revelations about the ship come as NATO prepares to boost its protection of the Baltic Sea to the next level. Media reports say that NATO ships will begin patrolling the sea in the areas where the cables run. The operation is currently meant to last until April. This is meant to dissuade from any further sabotage activities that are believed to have been carried out by the so-called Russian Shadow Fleet. Finland, however, is ready to do even more to ensure the region's safety.
Finland just recently, during Christmas, successfully intercepted a Shadow Fleet vessel. And we will look into the legal and other conditions for better protecting infrastructure.
What's more, the anchor of the Eagle S has been found by Finnish police. It is believed that the ship dragged the anchor to cause damage to the seabed cables. Although the telecom cables should be repaired in a fairly short amount of time, with some as early as January, the S-Link 2 power cable is a different matter. There is currently no deadline for its repair, although some forecasts point to it being fixed somewhere in mid-2025.
And now we're zooming in on the Baltic to explore the story in greater detail. About 70% of Russia's oil sets sail from ports in the Baltic and the Black Sea. Some of it is carried on these so-called Dark Fleet tankers, which have become the maritime equivalent of teenagers trying to sneak back home after curfew with the headlights off. They are elusive, they're a bit shady, and they just might be dropping odd sensor-type devices into the water while they're at it. Recently, folks in the Baltic region have said, "Oh, hold up, that's not happening on our watch." Indeed, Finland and Estonia decided they are so done with the Kremlin's under-the-radar naughtiness that they seized one of these Dark Fleet ships, known as the Eagle S. And they have made it perfectly clear that if you're messing with critical undersea internet cables or threatening maritime infrastructure, they will gleefully show you their new national hobby, impounding rogue vessels. Now, the European Union, NATO, and especially their new Secretary-General Mark Rutte have probably let out a collective sigh of relief. They were all sitting around wearing matching Russia is being naughty again t-shirts, but no one quite knew who would stand up first. Then Finland and Estonia said, "Give us the baton, we're done waiting, we'll show you how it's done." And to say that this has earned them a standing ovation from other Baltic allies would be an understatement. Latvia also refuses to be overlooked. Their Prime Minister told the BBC their government has the power to seize those ships which do not obey international law and impose threats to critical infrastructure. It sends a very clear message that if any shady tankers decide to swirl suspiciously in Latvian waters, they might find themselves sidelined like a rowdy fan at a hockey game. Hybrid attacks, if you're new to the phrase, are basically the Franken creations of modern warfare. They're part espionage, part sabotage, part good old-fashioned troublemaking. The challenge is to catch those carrying out attacks and then to call Russia out. And let's talk about the English Channel for a second. Up to a dozen Dark Fleet tankers glide through it every single day. Think about that the next time you're on a ferry and pass a big tanker with some cryptic name painted in chipped white letters on the side. NATO navies observe them, track them, but until recently did very little to actually deter them. For years, Russia has gambled on the idea that these grey zone tactics are too ambiguous to provoke a direct response. But now that we have got suspicious packages exploding in warehouses, mysterious fires at defense industry facilities, and undersea cables severed on the daily, it's time to say enough is enough. Russia's expanding hybrid war against Europe needs to be exposed. And now, here to shed more light on the issue is Teivo Teivainen, Professor of Politics at the University of Helsinki. Hello and welcome to Eastern Express.
Wonderful to be here in Eastern Express again.
So it is often said that by doing what he does, Vladimir Putin is testing our boundaries and our responses. Are we passing the test so far when it comes to the security of the Baltic?
Well, the overall answer might be yes, depends on the criteria. But it's complicated because on the one hand, in the Baltic, you have international waters and there are various legal constraints related to very old maritime law that prevent certain actions in international waters. Then again, there has been some action, for example, here in Finnish waters quite recently.
So we're going to have patrols by NATO vessels. So within the military realm, do you think that this is the response that we should have gone for, essentially? The one that might deter Russia from further activities of this kind?
Well, it does seem, as you said, NATO is emphasizing the Baltic a little bit more. I think the fleet that operates in the North Sea and the Baltic Sea will have more presence in the Baltic Sea. So obviously that presence may deter some of the possible actions we have seen or suspected in recent months related to cables and stuff. Then there's the more general issue about the so-called dark fleet and its operations and the question of carrying oil out of Russia for sale. And it might be slightly more difficult to deter that, especially when it's about international waters and sort of traditional freedom of transport in international waters. So the presence of military ships by NATO does not necessarily deter Russia from continuing with its dark fleet.
And this is where another approach might be coming in, because we are talking about a multi-pronged strategy here. On the one hand, we have military activities, which we've already mentioned, but apparently there are also steps that have been taken by the Finnish government which could actually point towards a solution. Apparently they have taken the offending tanker into custody and determined that it is not seaworthy, that it would take a long time to conduct all the necessary repairs. Do you think that this could be the approach that we need with respect to the shadow fleet? Because in many cases, these vessels are not really up to modern standards when it comes to safety and other applicable regulations.
Yes, there has been a lot of conversation, partially inspired by the recent action by Finnish authorities about enforcing, for example, stricter control of insurance by the vessels that operate in the Baltic Sea. In the particular case of the vessel that is now held in Finnish waters, one has to remember that through some kind of convincing, Finnish authorities were able to get it moved supposedly voluntarily to Finnish waters and then doing all kinds of checks and detaining it within Finnish waters is legally easier. Then it's another ball game when one starts stopping and checking ships in international waters. So, but certainly the Finnish action by the authorities around the Eagle S tanker, the fact that it's still in Finnish waters is inspiring a lot of conversation about what to do. But it's not always as simple as in the case of that particular tanker, because it happened to enter Finnish waters without apparent sort of enforcement that might have violated some rules.
Do you think it's still doable, though? I mean, there is a compelling argument, i.e. environmental constraints. We've seen one of these tankers sink to the bottom of the Black Sea, causing massive environmental damage. So we can say, well, we need to make sure everything is above board to essentially prevent something like that happening in the Baltic. Would that be enough to make it possible to stop these vessels in transit, inspect them, and say, well, you're not compliant, you have to go with us?
Yes, I think the environmental dimension is entering the game quite a lot. Maritime lawyers are debating the limits and the possibilities of enforcing checks in international waters, and it's important to observe where those deliberations will go. But certainly the environmental damage risk will be used in the debates. There in Finland, there's been some conversation like to what extent Russia might be even willing to deliberately cause environmental damage. And perhaps then the coasts of Finland are less risky in that sense, because a major leak here would probably affect also Russian coasts. So perhaps for that kind of action, like actually deliberately creating leaks, that might be more understandable from Russian perspective if it happens further away from Russian shores, meaning in the Baltic, closer to Germany and other parts of Baltic states, or even Sweden and Denmark.
So let's talk about accountability. Can Russia invoke the long-standing principle of feasible deniability when it comes to these tankers? They're not owned by Russia. Russia says, we have nothing to do with the Eagle S, we don't care. But is it really so? Can ownership be tracked down to ultimately the companies that are using these vessels to, power the Russian economy by carrying oil in contravention of sanctions?
Well, as we know, in world economy, it's become, in some sense, easier to hide final ownership, and there are all kinds of mechanisms having to do with jurisdictions and ownership in jurisdictions, so-called tax havens and others, where knowing who is the ultimate owner in terms of controller of the operations has become quite difficult. And there has been a lot of debate about this in financial world, in how, tax evasion happens and all that. And now we get the security dimension to the issue with the Russian fleet, as you mentioned. So this whole situation and the security incentives there might mean that there will be more effective controls in terms of hiding ultimate ownership. But it has been a common practice in our capitalist world that ultimate ownership has been hidden. And many countries, including Finland, have been actively sometimes enhancing such legislation that helps owners hide their ownership. So it's a very complicated issue, and it's difficult to change the rules of game there only for security-related reasons for Russian ownership of these tankers. But then again, it might lead to more general changes in how easy it is to track ownership structures in world economy.
Now, what do you think about the response of the companies that operate these vessels? If they see that the vessels are being impounded, perhaps confiscated due to inspections, due to violating applicable regulations, are they not likely to take the hint that, oh, this is likely to be expensive, we could lose our ships? So does it really make sense for us to continue working for the Russians if this carries such serious risks for us? Because we know words, word carries around in these circles, right?
I think that kind of messaging is part of the action, including the Finnish action. Of course, no authority will perhaps directly tell you that's the case, but by making life a little bit more uncomfortable for the owners of the ships, and to some extent even perhaps to the ship and its personnel itself, is obviously sending a message. This is what may happen to people and companies who deal with Russians. I think it's very clear it's one of the intended messages. Then again, the authorities, of course, don't want to give the impression, which might be legally problematic, that they are deliberately trying to make life too uncomfortable, for example, for the personnel of such ships. But I think it's part of the game, and there's a balancing act, and that message is being sent to these owners of the fleet.
And to end on a cautionary note, some people say that the current situation proves that the so-called NATO lake is a myth. Would you agree?
Well, of course, there's more NATO presence in the Baltic, in the shore countries, and the fact that we, on the one hand, we have Russia and the Kaliningrad part, and also on the other hand, something that has become more visible, there is an international area protected by certain clauses of maritime law, means that it is not and legally cannot be totally controlled by NATO. So in that sense, it cannot be totally a NATO lake.
Professor Teivo Teivainen was our guest today here on TVP World. Thank you very much for joining us and for sharing your expertise.
Thank you.
And now moving on to Eastern News Flash, a series of all the other stories from the East that you absolutely don't want to miss. First, a follow-up on the story we have covered earlier this week. Russia has announced that in 2024, it expelled nearly twice as many migrants as in the preceding year, exceeding 80,000 in total.
The shocking number of expelled migrants comes in the wake of Moscow's decision to crack down on migration after the Crocus City Hall attack last year, in which more than 140 people died. The attack was allegedly carried out by a group of Tajik nationals, and the Islamic State claimed responsibility for it. While the report on the expulsions by the state-run TASS news agency does not specify the nationalities of the expelled migrants, the vast majority of foreign workers in Russia are from post-Soviet Central Asian countries. Compared to over 80,000 in 2024, only 44,000 migrants were reportedly expelled from Russia in 2023. An expulsion order in this case usually means that a person is banned from entering Russia for 5 years.
Poland has closed its consulate in St. Petersburg at Russia's request. The decision comes after Warsaw shut down a Russian consulate in the Polish city of Poznań back in October.
The closure of the Russian consulate in Poznań last year came after Russia was accused of sabotage attempts against Poland and its allies. In the wake of these incidents, Warsaw threatened to close all of Russia's consulates across its territory if the terrorism it pinned on Moscow continued. Tensions between Russia and Poland have been particularly high, even when compared to other NATO member states. Poland has been a staunch supporter of Kiev since the war's onset. Both countries have expelled several of each other's diplomats and barely hold any sort of diplomatic relations. In a huge espionage trial in 2023, Poland convicted 14 Russian, Belarusian and Ukrainian citizens on charges of sabotaging aid deliveries to Ukraine on Moscow's behalf as part of a spy ring.
The breakaway Moldovan region of Transnistria says it has less than a month of gas left. The shutdown of Russian supplies to the region has thrown it into a deep crisis, which has affected thousands of ordinary citizens.
Transnistria has been unable to provide heating and hot water to its residents since January 1st. With the start of the year, Moscow had cut off gas supplies to Moldova over allegedly unpaid debts. As temperatures drop below zero, many people living in the region have been forced to burn wood or rely on plug-in heaters. The massive surge in demand for electricity has also put an incredible strain on the region's Soviet-era power grid. Authorities have had to introduce blackouts across Transnistria to conserve as much power as possible. The region's largest power station has switched to burning coal, but even those reserves are not expected to last for more than some 50 days. Operating the plant at its full capacity with coal is also reportedly dangerous due to the site's outdated equipment.
US lawmakers are reportedly poised to ban the recognition of a Georgian Dream government. This comes less than 2 weeks after the party's pro-Russian founder was sanctioned for undermining Georgia's democracy in favor of Russia.
According to Fox News, the bill has bipartisan support in the US House of Representatives. The media outlet has gained access to the document, which would bar the recognition or normalization of relations with any Georgian government headed by Bidzina Ivanishvili or any proxies, due to the Georgian Dream's crackdown on the protests sweeping across the country. In December, the US Department of State sanctioned the pro-Russian billionaire for, to quote, undermining the democratic and Euro-Atlantic future of Georgia. The sanctions as well as tensions with Washington come at a pivotal time for Georgia. Observers warn that the country is currently walking a thin line between a further pivot into Moscow's hands or a return to closer relations with the European Union and the United States.
And for this episode of Eastern Express, it's the end of the line. Please stay with us here on TVP World for more latest news and updates.